Hi there everybody, welcome to a new episode of the vlog. If you've seen my videos before, you may know that I've covered a number of rock and roll history related topics in the past, but I figured it was time for me to make a more linear playlist on the history of the genre. So I guess if I'm going to do that, I should start from the beginning and make a video all about the very origins of the genre. And to be honest, I've wanted to make a video like this for some time now, but it's very difficult for me to actually construct like a linear narrative of how the genre came to be. Truth be told, one of the reasons for this is because there really is no inciting incident that took place that meant that rock and roll is a thing now, and this is the definitive first rock song. A lot of people will go back and describe Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets to be the first real big hit rock and roll song. It's certainly the first definitively rock and roll song to reach #1 on the Billboard charts. It was actually released in 1954, but it didn't receive... I don't think it was that big a hit until it was featured in the movie Blackboard Jungle in 1955, school movie. It's featured over the credits of that movie. It became a massive smash hit. You can trace that song to America's fascination and craze with this new style of music. One important event that is often cited in the creation of this genre is when Alan Freed started using the term rock and roll in 1951. I think he'd heard it on some blues recording or maybe a pop recording and thought, that's a cool term to describe this new energetic form of music. So he started using it in 1951, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons why that term would come to describe this new type of music. People will also go to Elvis's early Sun recordings, particularly his first one in 1954, That's All Right Mama. Some say, no, that's not rock and roll, that's rockabilly. And then Elvis, of course, signed with RCA in January of 1956, and it was his RCA recordings and his resulting TV appearances throughout 1956 that made him a huge household name, and he toured everywhere in 1956. And I don't need to tell the story of Elvis, everybody knows about Elvis. And Elvis was definitely rock and roll's first true superstar, and a lot of what would come to be in rock and roll in the late 50s and early 60s by a lot of artists would be sort of an admitted emulation of Elvis. And he was known for his movement as well, for sure. They didn't call him Elvis the Pelvis for nothing. TV cameras didn't film him from the waist up for nothing. There is a movement inherent in the way that he performs music that is, well, it's rock and roll. It's all an evolution, and I'm kind of moving backwards here because when I was in high school, I used to swear that the first rock and roll song ever was the song "The Fat Man" by Fats Domino. It was recorded in December of 1949, released in January of 1950, and it's got that rock and roll beat to it, and of course, it's by Fats Domino, who would later be recognized as one of the great founding fathers of rock and roll. But in retrospect, I can see how I was just kind of retroactively labeling that song as rock and roll. If you go back to that time in 1950 when that song came out, I don't think any of the reviews would have described it as a rock and roll record. I don't think there was really such a thing as a rock and roll record, with the exception that rock and roll was already a term used in the blues world for decades. You hear blues songs and jazz songs from like the 1910s and the 1920s using the term rock and roll. Now it's often used as like a sexual innuendo, and I mean, you can easily make the argument that sexuality is an inherent element to rock and roll as a genre. I mean, rock and roll is sort of inextricably linked to the free love movement from the 60s to the 80s, so there's a point to be made there that is sort of a continuation of that these inherently sexual songs from the 1920s become this new genre that has sexuality as a centering theme, honestly, in the genre, but also music that makes you want to, I mean, rock and roll means music that makes you want to move. So there's that too, and it becomes, I mean, that's certainly the more family-friendly interpretation of the term, but it's all true. It's all what rock and roll is all about. It's hard to name one thing that rock and roll is, and that, again, like I said, goes to its influences as well. The reason also that it's easy for me to label the Fat Man as the first rock and roll song is just because, yeah, like I said, Fats Domino, who starts his career on the R&B circuit, later becomes one of the original founding fathers of what is definitively referred to as rock and roll, with his recordings such as Ain't That a Shame and Blueberry Hill and I'm Walkin' and many more, released during the mid-50s. So it's easy to just look back through his career and say, no, but see, he was doing rock and roll before anyone else was. In reality, he was just signed with Imperial Records, one of the great R&B record labels that also had Lloyd Price and many others. And him, as well as his label mates, as well as rivals, and just everyone that was a part of the R&B scene, were a big part of the genre that really just sort of evolved into what we now describe as rock and roll. One of the reasons that it has evolved into what we now call rock and roll, and one of the reasons that songs like Rock Around the Clock were the first big hits on the American pop charts, definitely has a lot to do with the fact that, Bill Haley was a white artist, and a lot of rock's earliest successes are from white artists either covering songs written by black performers, or just stealing elements of their music. There's always been a lot of, there's a lot in the world of rock and roll that is derivative. It's a constantly evolving thing, and it comes from people taking little things from what came before them. But yeah, a lot of that certainly is that white record buying audiences were more likely to buy albums made by white performers. In fact, in the early days, if a black artist would release an album, often their face wasn't even on the front cover because the stores weren't allowed to carry them. It's all very dark, it's all very sad, and it's all not really what I wanted this video to be about. But it is one of those things it's impossible to ignore in the history of rock and roll, that a lot of its initial success and continued success comes from, a lot of the blues and jazz traditions that originated in black culture in the 1910s, 1920s, through the Harlem Renaissance, and well after that with these R&B traditions. But there's also a country music influence in there as well, of course. I mean, if you listen to any number of the Sun Records artists, you'll see some rockabilly recordings that are, again, really bridging that gap between what was country and what would be rock and roll. Now, when it comes to a perfect merging of those two, I don't know. To me, one of the first truly realized merging into this new thing called rock and roll, that is definitively different from the jazz, blues, and R&B traditions, was Buddy Holly. In 1957, I think he did a lot to create a genre with a new identity. And yeah, there's so many artists that I haven't even mentioned that were incredibly important to the formation of the genre. I mean, I never even mentioned Chuck Berry. Think about that. And he got his start with an R&B combo and started recording some records for Chess that, again, really, like records like Maybelline, they're R&B records that sort of were just assigned to what the media was now calling rock and roll. These really upbeat sort of pop R&B fusion songs with some country thrown in too. He would have a number of songs throughout the 50s, including some songs that I would argue to be some of the first rock and roll anthems, songs like School Days and, Rock and Roll Music, of course. And then his biggest hit, Johnny Be Good, in 1958. I didn't even mention the Everly Brothers, who were further towards the country end of the early rock and roll spectrum, but had two enormous hits in 1957 with Bye Bye Love and Wake Up Little Susie, and continued to make massive hits through about 1962, and just had a long career and some really influential harmonies that hadn't been heard in rock and roll before. That's, I think, their greatest contribution to the genre, was some beautiful harmonies that would come to be a centerpiece of music, particularly in the 1960s. I didn't mention James Brown, who was really, again, in an R&B ensemble. I don't think he would describe his music being made as rock and roll really at any point. He really resisted that terminology He considered himself in the 50s to be a rhythm and blues artist, in the 60s to be a soul artist, and in the late 60s into 70s to be the godfather of his own music genre called funk that he helped originate. And yeah, but in these early days he was definitely just a rhythm and blues singer in a rhythm and blues band, and his music has sort of retroactively been added to what we now consider to be rock and roll. And oh gosh, Little Richard, who had so many of the earliest major rock and roll hits in the mid to late 50s, starting of course with Tutti Frutti in 1955. But in his early days of his career, probably the main way that his music got out to the people was that Elvis covered 4 of his songs, I think, maybe even more. 3 of which on that album. 3 of the songs on Elvis' second album there behind me are Little Richard originals, and I believe songs that Elvis took some of the publishing from to do that. And that was a big thing that was happening at the time. And Alan Freed, who I mentioned earlier, was certainly guilty of that, taking perhaps unearned publishing and songwriting credit merely for agreeing to play on the radio songs by certain black artists. There's like Chuck Berry songs that are listed as being written by Chuck Berry and Alan Freed that Alan Freed had nothing to do with. He just wanted to take some of the songwriting proceeds in exchange for playing the song on his radio stations. So yeah, certainly a lot of bad stuff going on. Certainly a lot of unfairness. Of course, Jackie Wilson. So much unfairness happened to him in his music career. He wound up broke because he was screwed out of a lot of money through some bad contracts and just outright lies. He was one of the originators of what we now call rock and roll as well, although again, in his day, he was making just rhythm and blues recordings that were getting a lot of radio play and making waves on the pop charts. There's so many more artists still that I haven't even mentioned. I mean, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison. I didn't mention, like, Johnny Cash. Okay, people like Johnny Cash, who were really just making country records, but now, again, in retrospect, we sort of realize how important they were to the genre that was that would become rock and roll. And I think the same goes for Ray Charles, who a lot of his early R&B recordings, songs like I Got a Woman, that song came out in 1954. It is now definitely recognized as a rock song, but when that song came out, rock and roll was not really a genre yet. And of course, he had a number of songs that would become sort of rock and roll standards, songs like What I Say, for example. Anyway, I could keep naming artists forever, and this video would just be an hour long, but I'm going to stop there. As you guys can tell, it is so hard for me to actually do like a linear just story of how rock and roll came to be. There's so many converging stories and lineages and different influences, so it's hard to make any linear narrative sense at all, but hopefully you've learned something. And also, yeah, I want to open this up as a discussion. Let me know in the comments if there's some sort of inciting event in the history of rock and roll that I may have missed, if there's something else interesting you would like to share. And also, check out some other videos that I've made. I did a video on the life and career of Fats Domino. I've also done a history series on James Brown. I made a video on the life and times of Little Richard. These are all subjects that have to do with the very foundations of this new genre. And I'll keep going forward. I'll keep talking about anything that I haven't talked about so far, getting into the late 50s and into the 60s in future videos. We'll see how I decide to do this, but I want to talk a lot more about rock history. Thanks so much for watching. Check out the description for links to where you can find my own music where it's sold or streamed online. Like this video if you like what you saw, subscribe to this channel if you've been enjoying my videos, and you can ring the notification bell as well if you want to be notified whenever I upload a new video, which should be real soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again real soon.